In this video, we're going to take a look at Callifolio Bleu. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. I can see this being a good standard blue for some people under the right conditions. The wrong conditions and it's dull and lifeless. Now there is some color variation by pen and some shading. Frequently, a well-behaved and decent blue, though it feels when it's not the best conditions as though it was put out without really caring about capturing people's attention. Like, okay, we have a blue, call it blue. As a go-to blue, maybe not for most, but it would be pretty okay. Depends on your pen. When giving its darker tone, it's very pleasant on the page. It's when you get the lighter tones that you really feel what this ink is missing. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Nib Singularity with a fine nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the medium nib, we get a decent blue tone. Not as dark as we were getting when you saw the original comments, but a decent blue tone. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does offer little bits of shading throughout it, and the shading when it shows up is quite nice. I can say, looking at this, I wish that in general this was a darker tone, and unfortunately in the writing samples, I'm not using any wet fines. Looking at the broad nib, it is, in general, a little bit lighter than we saw with the medium. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade quite a bit. You see it happen all through the first line. Other starts lighter, goes darker, and then a little lighter, where field starts lighter, works its way a little bit darker. But you see of goes light on the O, much darker on the bottom of the F. The amount of shading that this is giving is pretty nice. Looking at the stub nib, which tends to have problems writing on super smooth paper. Just as a note about this particular pen. Now, the tone is slightly darker on a more often than it was with the broad, but generally the tones are about the same as we get with the broad. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade really nicely. I think the shading shows up much better here than it did in either the medium or the broad. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with A Kaweco Sport with a medium nib. A Kaweco Sport with a broad nib. A Kaweco Sport with a 1.5 stub. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes Steno notebook. Looking at the medium nib, we get a little bit lighter tone than we had with the Clairfontaine. Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading, and there's almost no shade at all that's going on. I say almost no shade. There is a couple of spots. On the second line, that is a little bit darker than the word matter above it or units below. And in units below, at the TS, it does get a little bit darker than the rest of the word. The broad nib, disappointingly, was lighter than the medium. It does feather a little bit. You see it in of and electrons and protons and neutrons. It's basically always there, though I think the feathering could probably be lived with. It doesn't really spread. It's pretty good, and there are a couple moments, kinda, that it's a little darker, but I'm not going to say that this is really shading at all. Looking at the stub nib, it is only the tiniest bit darker than we had with the broad, still a little bit lighter than we had with the medium. Now, it does feather a tiny bit. It does spread just a tiny bit, both manageable. It does give a little bit of shading within the writing, just a little bit. You can see it in the word constantly. The T gets a little darker than the letters around it, and it ends a little darker than most of the word. So there is some shading there. Looking at the back of the page, you can see that the ink got deep into the paper, but it never came through and touched the page underneath. You might even be able to write on the back of this page because there's no ghosting. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in an AmPad Steno notebook. Looking at the medium nib, it is quite a bit lighter than we had with the Clairfontaine. There is a tiny bit of feathering going on. There is a tiny bit of spread. There is a little bit of shading. So when you see on the second line, search, you see that the E and the H are a little bit darker. And for the R is a little bit darker than the rest of the word. So it does shade some there. The tone is a little bit different than we had with the Clairfontaine, as a result of the yellow paper that it's on. The broad nib is much lighter than we had with the Clairfontaine, and the most noticeable thing to me is, while it's much lighter, and I was expecting the paper to really kind of affect this some, it still very much is a blue, meaning it is a bit more of an opaque color. Now, there's a tiny bit of feathers that occur. They are absolutely tiny. There is almost no spread. There are a few moments of shading that come up, which are pretty nice about it. I'm impressed that it holds on to being so blue. Looking at the stub nib, we get about the same tone that we had with the medium, a little bit darker than it is from that broad. It is feathering a tiny bit. You see it inside the A right on the first line. You see it on the right edges of the I and in on that top line. So it's there. It's not horrible. There's the really minutest amount of spread, although it is really there. It's not a big deal. Shading, none. Looking at the back of the page, we had no bleed through touching the page underneath, but you can see that the ink got quite deep in there. There is a little bit of ghosting, but I think you could easily write on the back of this page. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a National Steno notebook. Looking at the medium nib, still quite a bit lighter than we had with the Clairfontaine. A little affected in tone from the color of the paper, but not anything changing it from being a blue. Still very much a blue. Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is shading pretty darn well. Look at the word birthday. The H is quite a bit darker than the rest of the word. Y gets quite a bit darker. In April, you see that the bottom of the L, where I came back over the letter, is still quite a bit darker, so it does shade a little bit. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than the medium. It is not feathering. It is not spreading. It is shading a little bit. I do wish that when it shaded, it went a bit darker, but it's coming across so light as a tone that you can only expect it to really do so much. At least it is still very readable. It's not painful to read, so it's not bad. It's just being a nice light, almost baby blue in this case. Looking at the stub nib, it is just a tad bit lighter than we had with the broad. It is not feathering, it is not spreading, it is shading some, about as much as it did with the broad, and doing it really about as well. If you look at accepted on the first line, starting darker gets lighter to lighter to darker again, doing very well. On the second line, you see where the K of taking and the P of accepted hit, it got to a darker spot, just like in the round of the G. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, no problem writing back here. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Blackstone Barrier Reef Blue. Here is Diamine Prussian Blue. Here is Lamy Washable Blue. Here is Noodler's Bernanke Blue. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot Steno notebook. Looking at the medium nib, we get about the same tone that we've had on the other papers, which is a little lighter than that Clairfontaine. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is shading kind of decent really for what's going on. I'm pretty happy with how this looks here. I would prefer a more vivid blue, but this isn't too bad to look at. Easy on the eyes, especially with a paper of this tone. Looking at the broad nib, it is a lot lighter than the medium. Not real happy about that, but happy about the fact that it still actually is readable and it's not painful to read. So again, while it's light, it can still be easy. So that should be said about any of the light inks. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread. Yes, it is shading, and when it shades, it is really stand out. Unfortunately, a lot of the darker areas are dots on I's or commas and things like that. Looking at the stub nib, the most noticeable thing is all of a sudden it started to really put the ink out and it got really dark. Look at how dark it starts. Now it's going to lighten up through some of this writing. I wish it wrote that dark all the time because that is beautiful. All right, it does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade. But mostly what we're really seeing is it going from being a higher flowing to slowing down as far as the pen goes, so it's lightening as it goes. Looking at the back of the page, we had no bleed through touching the page underneath, and we have almost no ghosting, easily writing on the back of this. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a red ink from Colorverse, their Season 1 C Europa. Here is an orange ink by Graf von Faber-Castell, their Burnt Orange. Here is a magenta ink by Monteverde, their Napa Burgundy. Here is a yellow ink by KWZ, their El Dorado. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the medium nib, we get about the same tone that we've had on the other non-fountain pen papers. It does feather a tiny bit. It does spread a tiny bit. It does not shade. As far as I'm concerned, this is not bad in what's going on here. You just have to be aware of what you're going to get for your performance. And as long as it doesn't bleed through, then it's a winner. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a tad bit lighter than we had with the medium. It does feather, it does spread, it does not shade. It is a distinct blue on this, so for that, at least it does stand out as not being the same blue that everybody in your office would have coming out of their ballpoint or rollerball pens. So it is distinct in that kind of way, which is a positive. Looking at the stub nib, it's a little darker than the broad, about the same tone that we had with the fine on this paper. It feathers the most of any of them. It spreads just a little bit. It does not shade. It's just kind of there. But I can see this being used, again with that caveat that if it doesn't bleed, then this is a winner because it is a unique blue on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, we had nothing that came and bled through to the other side, so there's a winner. However, looking at the back, you probably couldn't because of the amount of ghosting going on with how deep the ink got into the paper. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? So this is an interesting one to choose as a pen because for me, I would avoid dry pens because it's too light. However, it does give a unique tone that doesn't look like every other blue that's out there. It's just too light for me as a tone. I really like the darker tone that I get from wetter pens. Personally, I would go for a wet fine or a very wet if you use extra fine for the nicest tone on this ink. And even still, you should be able to get a little bit of shading, which is pretty nice. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you did, do all that YouTubery stuff. Thanks for watching.